Red. The Unity hymnal changes the word to soul, and it's far from the only hymnal that removes it. We don't like the word fear either, as in, 'twas grace that taught my heart to fear. I get it. I do. I was once totally behind it, especially the fear word. I never could quite get comfortable with the whole God-fearing thing. Loves and protects me, and I'm afraid never sat well with me in concert. Still doesn't. Add to that, I just don't believe the whole God desires our fear thing. And that word, wretch. I mean, right there where it is in that sentence. A wretch like me? If I'm singing this song, am I saying that I am a wretch? I don't think I'm a wretch. I don't want to think that the other people standing next to me singing this song are wretches. We're humans, sure, subject to human frailty and failure. But wretches? Like most people, I knew all the words to the song, and I loved it. And I sang it often. Yet, I never really listened to the words. Never thought about the words. Thought about, well, what the song was actually about. But in 2006, a mainstream production movie came out about John Newton, the man who wrote the lyrics to Amazing Grace. And the trailers to the movie said that the man was the captain of a slave ship until grace of God opened his eyes. The very idea that a man who captained slave ships could write a song like that, it surprised me, shocked me even. I mean, the captain of a ship engaged in the Atlantic trade of African slaves. Now, to start with, I'm one of those people who thinks that slavery is the single most horrible institution ever devised by humans. People talk about the shame of being a slave. Shame for being a slave? Horror being a slave? Sorrow and pain and loss and helplessness and hopelessness, that's being a slave. But shame? Shame is for owning a slave. What blot on the soul could be more dark or more deep than just the act of believing you actually own another human being? And the transport of slaves. In all times, in all places, the transport of slaves, especially newly captured slaves, has always been particularly brutal and heart-wrenching. But of all the records and all the writings and all the understandings we have of the brutal transport of slaves through the ages, probably the most horrible, the most dehumanizing, the most mind-bendingly shocking in its application as an institution was the transport of African slaves across the Atlantic in the 1700s. I won't go into a description of the slave holds, but I will note that during the 8 to 16-week trip, the tightly packed ships had a death rate that often exceeded 30%, sometimes more than 50%. So all this spinning around my mind, I went and I read his story. And then I sang the song again. And I cried. I realized in a flash what that song was about. It's about redemption. Not just any old redemption. Not the redemption of Mother Teresa. Not the redemption of the coal miner who spends all night in the coal mine and then all day in the fields to keep shoes on his kids' feet. Not the redemption of the sin for taking an extra serving of ribs at the potluck or not sending a thank you letter to Grandma. Not the redemption of telling the self-checkout that your steak is a corn on the cob. We don't like that word wretch there in that beautiful song, because those are the kinds of sins that are part of our life and we easily forgive, not the sins of wretches. The reality is we're not so sure about those wretches. I mean, somebody really and truly wretched. We kind of don't want to actually think that God forgives and brings home those evil people who do the kinds of things that make news stories that we try to hide from our kids. Some of us are not so sure about contemplating the redemption of the person who sits at the light and doesn't move when it turns red, turns green. There are very few people in the modern world who would not consider someone who captained a slave ship a wretch. I mean, we can come around forgiving someone for advocating to drill baby drill. There are very few people in the modern world. Sorry, I lost my place. But this, it brings home what we mean by truly bad. That word wretch gives so much more power to that song. We're not talking about no downstream redemption, no easy lift. Just how far does God's grace go? I say, when Jesus died on the cross, we were all redeemed. Redeemed, by the way, means to buy back that which was lost or sold. When Jesus died, the price for our souls was paid in blood. What does that mean? It means that John Newton could be saved. It meant that the grace of God could fill his heart, open his eyes, bring him to understand who he was and what he did. And then it could fill his heart with love, acceptance, and forgiveness. We might wonder, why do I really care about that? Horrible things like this man did are the things I read about in history or the news, not the things of my life. Why would I want to taint such a beautiful song with the understanding that even a wretch like John Newton could be saved? After all, I may not be perfect, but I'm not that bad. Am I? Don't we all have a tendency to judge ourselves harshly for our failures? No matter how many Easters we celebrate, do we not still wonder on some dark and sorrowful days if maybe our sins are more than God will forgive? Do we yet fear on some days that God does not love us? Oh, that word, fear. You see, after I read about the life of John Newton, I realized that what he was saying in this song was not that grace taught his heart to fear God, but that God put John in a situation so dire, so dangerous, that he became so fearful that, atheist though he thought he was, he cried out to God to save him. And in a flash, he realized he did believe in God. It made him realize that God's love was there for him. Made him see the realities of how he was living his life. He felt fear because he suddenly realized he wanted God's love. But perhaps God couldn't love someone like him. But God did love him. And we, in our fears that God can't love us, no matter how irrational those fears may be, we can look at John Newton and know if God could forgive and redeem that man, then God will forgive me too, even on my very worst day. This is also important because we don't actually know how bad our worst day might be. No matter how strongly I believe differently, I don't know what the future holds or what sins I might end up committing. There's a prayer, a shortened version of Proverbs 39, 7 through 9. God, give me not poverty, lest I steal. A specific example of the concept of not judging a man till you've walked a moon in his moccasins. I will contend that we do not know. We don't know just how far we can go in our ability to not see something as bad because that badness interferes with our goals. I mean, how did John Newton cope with the suffering of humans? Humans under his care at a level that likely would have made him angrily chastise the ship owners if he had been treating horses or cattle in his hole like that. And we don't know how we will react to certain levels of fear, anger, or despair. We all think we know ourselves, but we actually only know how we hope we will react, not how we will. When I was in college, I spent some time as a volunteer at the Battered Women's Center. I would see women come in, battered and bruised and terrified, clutching a couple of equally terrified kids, and they would be shuffled off to a safe house. And a month later, I would hear that she was back with the man. And another month, and there she was at the door, clutching the same terrified kids, sporting a whole new set of bruises. And I said, I was so self-righteous. I was so sure when I said, that will never be me. Okay, it's true, he never hit me, although I think it would have gotten there. Almost 20 years later, it was me. And the only reason I left that man was because he threw me out. I was beaten down so low I couldn't change lanes on the freeway if I could see another car. When, after it had ended, I had a long talk with an old friend about the realities of my life for the previous several years, he was shocked. He said, I would have thought if someone treated you like that, you would have ripped off his head and spit down his neck. Yeah, I kind of thought that too. There, but by the grace of God. In 2013, an illusionist named Darren Brown aired a reality show called The Push. The basic plot was that through staged events and careful scripted manipulation, the crew tried to convince an individual to push a person off of a roof. While no one will say how many people were sent through the process, or how many did or didn't decide to push, we know from what was aired that at least 3 people did decide to push. No one was hurt, by the way, except probably the people who did push and woke up in the middle of the night for the rest of their lives thinking about what they had decided to do. And maybe you won't even get to decide. What about just a moment of carelessness or bad luck with horrible results? Read about that in the news any day you care to look. When I lived in a little town on the Russian River called Monterrey, there was an old metal bridge across the river. The kids would drop things off the bridge on the upstream side and then dash across the bridge to watch it float out the other side. The problem was that the way the bridge was constructed, You could not see the kids on the rail until they dashed out. Well, one day traffic was stopped going across the bridge. The fireman holding traffic said that 2 young kids had dashed out right in front of a loaded contractor's truck and both been struck dead. They needed an ambulance for the contractor. He had no injuries. He just felt such horror from what he had done, even though there was no way they could have stopped. And believe me, the CHPs measured and looked at everything. What am I getting to here? That any one of us could have been, or still could be, John Newton. There, but by the grace of God, go I. Amen. Sure, this is a level of redemption not common, and it's highly unlikely that anyone here will need redemption like that. But it makes a difference to know if your human self commits something horrible, that your soul can still be redeemed. My sister's first husband was a firefighter. One night he got called out to a car wreck. There were 2 teenage sisters. The car and the girls were both totally mangled. They put each girl on a separate helicopter and sent them to separate hospitals, so each would have all the resources possible. That's a lot of resources to spend on one family. All the emergency personnel and trucks and helicopters and hospital space and medical personnel, just to save the lives, and hopefully limbs, of 2 people. But I doubt anyone in that community would have said it shouldn't have been spent that way, and I will pay the taxes to do it too. Because if it was their kid, their mother, their brother, or their own self laying there on that highway, they want to know that helicopter is there for them too. Myself, I am very grateful that John Newton could be redeemed. Because should my human self ever fail, and life causes me to do something I never wanted to do, and never thought I would do, I know my soul is not lost. Blessed be.